Stephen, you're very welcome to my show. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you, a man of deep faith and someone who has written this new tome, and I want to hear all the details. Pilgrimage to the Museum. And along with that, of course, you've had this long and distinguished career on Wall Street. So I'm sure there are already listeners and viewers, because we're going to post this on YouTube at some point, wondering how do both of those go together? And maybe some of them are rolling their eyes. You know, they think of Wall Street, oh gosh, greed is good.
Yeah, I always think, how do they not go together? 40 years on Wall Street, running billions of dollars through all the ups and downs. I don't know how I would have done it without a deep faith. And I know there's folks that are successful for short periods of time, ripping people's eyeballs out of their skulls. That's not the approach, a Christian would take, frankly. And there are a lot of folks on Wall Street who actually have deep faith, John. You'd be surprised. Some of them are very good friends of mine. And a lot of the great Christian virtues work really well on Wall Street if you're thinking about long-term integrity, self-mastery, ability to control your emotions, prudence, servant leadership. Some of these virtues could probably make a book of it. In fact, it's on my list to write up. But it's been a wonderful career on Wall Street for me, but I don't know how I would have done it without my faith.
So you say there are a lot of good people on Wall Street. I don't doubt that. I'm familiar and know a lot of them myself. They may not be people of faith. Some are people of faith, but they're very charitable. And some of them go about their lives in a humble way and, help others. And it's kind of an interesting mixture, not something that comes up in conversation much. Again, people think of Wall Street as this place of greed is good, as we said just at the start. And
sometimes it works in the short term, but it never works in the long term.
Yeah. So how do you apply your faith on Wall Street? So you mentioned it there sort of briefly.
Well, as a leader, I'm an investment officer of Federated Hermes equity division. So it's a pretty, a lot of very smart people working with me. And, as a leader, Christian virtues, obviously we're a non-denominational firm. Diversity is what actually makes a good investment process, among other things. But certainly a lot of the aspects of servant leadership are very important to me in how I, manage the equity division at Federated. Humility, thinking of yourself as there to make your portfolio manager successful as opposed to have them make you successful, changes everything about the dynamic in the workplace. And I think it does lead to greater long-term success. Sometimes short-term failures, but that's what life on Wall Street is like. And that's what the spiritual life is like too, John, as you know. Ups and downs, and the pilgrimage to the museum is like that in some ways. It takes you through the ups and downs of man's search for God through 5,000 years. And in some ways, it's a microcosm of my own life and maybe many of the readers.
Yeah, and the book is out this month and has gotten some nice reviews, and it has gotten blurbs from a lot of distinguished leaders in our community. I noticed that Cardinal Timothy Dolan wrote a nice piece about it, so it's off to a good start. Before we get into the book, I just go back to Wall Street, Stephen, because I don't get these opportunities all that much to talk to people at a high level on Wall Street like you, a person of faith. Although, I do know people on Wall Street who are people of faith, but they're not public figures. You think of all the big bonuses and the money that's made and so on. That can by itself corrupt an individual. So How does that work? How does that play with somebody's faith, their morals, and how they deal with big money?
Yeah, I mean, stewardship, right, John? If you think of yourself in the context of I'm a steward of wealth for my clients, but even the wealth that the Lord sort of grants me, perhaps through success on Wall Street, my wife and I truly view ourselves as the stewards of that, not as the owners of it. And when you think about that, you think, what would a good steward do? And so the projects that we undertake and support, and I think there's a lot of folks on Wall Street who view their wealth that way. So again, I think my Christian values, if you will. I mean, I wish I was a saint. I'm not, but they've certainly helped me deal with issues like that and not be so attached to money that I'm willing to sacrifice my morals or run over people or cheat people to make more of it. I probably could have made a lot more money, perhaps in the short term, but I don't know that I would have built the spiritual reservoir of wealth that I'm going to need to get into heaven. So,
and of course, we know a lot of people on Wall Street donate so much money to charitable causes and institutions. It must be stated here.
Yeah, I mean, Wall Street community in general usually has been pretty generous with folks. I'm not here to defend the entire Wall Street community. There's plenty of folks that kind of meet. In fact, my first book, Missionary of Wall Street, John.
Yeah, we just spoke about that before we went on air, and you got my attention. Tell us about it.
Well, in a way, it was, it was Sophia's idea, the publisher. I always call it Delivered by Grace, but they were playing with this idea of people's image of the Wolf of Wall Street. Mm. And here's this Wall Street guy who spends his evenings out on the streets of New York trying to bring people back to the church, and so the Missionary of Wall Street kind of idea. But I've had many Wall Streeters help me on that mission. We still are doing it to this day. We do it 4 times a year out on the streets. We've spoken to over 3 million people.
3 million people? Wow.
Yeah.
You must have been up on it.
There's a good flow. There's a large volume of people coming through the streets of New York in over 12 years. If you have 150 missionaries out there, you can rack up those kinds of numbers. Now, spoken to is one thing, spoken with is another. So actual meaningful conversations, probably a couple 100,000. And of those, we think we brought back, and we don't have a ticker, but roughly 15 to 20,000 folks that we brought back to the church after many, many years away, with some really positive results. When folks come out of that church, they've been to confession for the first time in a long time, they feel the Lord's love, they're kind of floating. Someone wanted to ask me, Steve, like, you're a numbers guy, how can you think this could make any sense? They did the math on, 20,000 versus 3 million. I think it's something like 0.05% chance of having success on any individual that you introduce yourself to, which is extremely low margin. My answer is I make it up on volume. Because if you can bring one person back, just one, maybe to a spiritual life that increases their odds of getting to heaven. I mean, 1 times eternity is equal to eternity. And, I think we're all called to try to get to heaven and to bring as many people with us as we can. But, Missionary of Wall Street, that's a very radical evangelization. It's full of wonderful stories. If you haven't read it, I'd recommend it. It got,
and who really is the missionary? Is that singling out you or somebody else, or is it just the title?
Well, it's the title, but it's probably singling out me as the leader of this. Again, my title is Delivered by Grace, because the book is about, in some ways, it's a story about people that are delivered by the grace of God. But in the end of the book, you finally get it, that the people that are truly delivered by grace end up being the missionaries. Like the transformative power of working with God on a project, I think people underestimate that. It itself transforms your own soul to a certain extent. So yeah, I think Missionary of Wall Street's a little bit presumptive, frankly. I struggled with that title when it was proposed, but it did accomplish the objective of making the book, I think, something interesting for people. It's sort of the way we started this interview, John, like,
yeah,
and how possibly a guy from Wall Street could be a missionary.
Yeah. Now, so were these just random individuals who were coming through the subways? Were they people of faith already who had, lost the faith? Were they Catholic, non-Catholic? Because you're a Catholic, so when you're talking about bringing them back to the faith, I presume bringing them back to the Catholic faith.
Yeah, well, our broader objective is to bring people closer to God. And we do the mission out on street corners in Soho, which is one of the most affluent neighborhoods in New York City, around the original St. Patrick's Cathedral, called the St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, although more recently we've begun doing it at St. Patrick's Cathedral as well. But yeah, they're out on the street corner, passers-by on their way to dinner. And we start our conversation with a very simple question: are you Catholic? And you get all sorts of reactions to that question. Some people simply ignore you. Some people laugh at you. Some people say, I was Catholic. Some people say, I'm sort of Catholic. And some people say, no, I'm not Catholic. Why are you interested? I'm Jewish, or I'm Protestant, or I'm Muslim. And virtually all of the conversations where people give us that kind of an answer, like I am Catholic, I'm Muslim, all of those end up being a pretty meaningful dialogue. And many of those folks end up in some way or another, at least visiting the church. I've been amazed at, this year in particular, how many non-Catholics were interested in having a conversation with us. Their images of Catholics are kind of judgmental, difficult people to deal with, kind of lots of rules and regulations. And when they're approached with someone with love and joy in their heart, they're kind of taken aback and they're kind of intrigued.
Yeah.
And the conversation ends up going a lot better than they or the missionary would have imagined.
Yeah, it reminds me of what, it's not their full mission, but Sisters of Life, when they're on the streets of New York City, they draw people to them.
They draw people. I call them the atomic weapons. They join us. They're among the missionaries that we've used, John. And they are literally atomic weapons. They're out there in their habits. And I'll tell you, former Catholics even, somehow or other, they can snub a missionary, a lay missionary, but boy, they cannot snub a nun.
Yeah.
They're so joyful.
Yeah.
They are really wonderful.
Yeah, they've done so much for New York City. The humility there is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And the level of intelligence may be added as well, and wisdom. But it's got to be very difficult in New York City. This is New York City, politically for sure, is liberal. However we describe that, certainly socially liberal, right? On the extreme side. We don't want to spend the show talking about abortion, but as extreme abortion laws, and that sort of exemplifies that. So hard nuts, I should say, to crack maybe in New York City.
Yeah, you could take that view. It's like the two shoe salesmen that go to Africa, and one comes back and says, forget about it. No one here has any shoes. The other one says, this is unbelievable. No one here has any shoes, So,
right.
In New York, you have all these folks pursuing a secular lifestyle that have fallen away from God. and have been convinced by the culture this is going to make them happy. And frankly, John, in my experience from thousands of conversations with folks, many of them are not actually. And when they're approached by someone, a perfect stranger, there's something wonderful about it. I mean, it's someone who's joyful, loving, confident, and humble. These are all disarming traits of Christians. It's the same traits that helped the Christians conquer the Roman Empire, really, right? And when they're approached that way, people embrace it, actually. I was surprised. We did the mission just for Holy Week this year, and it was their first time out on the streets, really, in 3 years because of COVID. And I was frankly a little bit concerned. We'd lost a number of missionaries, one who had died, a few had moved away, et cetera. And so we're a little light-handed. I was a little bit nervous about how this was going to go. And what's impressive is that typically through the course of a week or two, doing this, you'll always get a few people when they leave, like, because they're feeling so good about themselves suddenly, unexpectedly. I got more hugs this week in the midst of all this chaos you're referring to, and all the secular. I got more hugs than I've ever gotten on a mission in New York City. So there's something here, and we shouldn't underestimate the power of love and joy.
Yeah.
In Christ's message. I mean, it's not that surprising when you think about it. I know we've been trained to believe it should be surprising, but it's really not.
Yeah, yeah. So you're dealing with the culture. Quickly go back to Wall Street. My favorite biblical quotes, and correct me if I've gotten them a little bit wrong, or I'm paraphrasing, I guess. The love of money is the root of all evil, and happy is the poor of spirits, because theirs will be the kingdom of heaven. So in other words, you could be the wealthiest man on the planet, right? But you could get into the place above very quickly if your heart is set in the right. So in other words, there's nothing wrong with having accumulated wealth. It's how you deal with it and your attitude.
You use it. How you use it. You use it for yourself, or you're using it for the world. And our wealth these days, by the way, John, it's not just our money, but it's our time. I mean, you sort of were asking me about this off camera, like, how does a guy from Wall Street have the time to write a book, particularly one as extensive as something like this last book I just wrote, Pilgrimage to the Museum? And, we all have time. They were given by God. It's one of the great talents. And in today's world, frankly, it's worth more than money. And it's a question of how we use it,
Using your time, yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about this book. It's great. It covers, a lot of time, a huge historical sweep of the art world, I presume up to the present. And the point is made in the biographical details and notes that in today's world, God is not typically associated with art, right? But it was in medieval times and in, different generations. That has all changed. Explain all that to us. Why we went from, this art with God as the central focus, and now we have what? The new art world, which has sort of gotten away from that, although there's a hint that it's coming back.
Right. So this is our other evangelical project in New York. My wife and I on Friday nights do these tours of the museum, and they're designed to bring people closer to God through art. And it's the basis of the book in a lighter way that's maybe not as radical and scary as meeting people, strangers on the streets, right? And the idea here is, and I'm kind of in some ways an art historian's worst nightmare. I was trained in classical art history
Hmm.
at Princeton. I don't have a degree in art history. My degree is in history and economics, but took a lot of coursework in that field and fancy myself a classically trained art historian in some ways. But once I had this reconversion experience 20 years ago, I was always a Catholic, but kind of found my faith in a much deeper way, in a kind of dramatic moment, if you will. But I began to see everything differently. And it occurred to me that art is a key way that God communicates with man. Art is beauty. God is perfect beauty. And artists who have the image of God in their soul, like all of us, are seeking that beauty. So I firmly believe, and you could say, well, I don't, but just work with me for a moment. I believe all artists, whether they're Catholic or atheists, and all of them appear in Pilgrimage to the Museum, I believe all of them are seeking their creator through their art. And if you approach the art with that point of view and just work with me on that, the book opens up for people what's really going on. The reason we wrote the book was that we found in the tours, whereas, the secular world, and not to be critical, but, it's just so politically problematic to mention God. The secular world tries to describe art in a kind of clinical archaeological fashion, and often very accurately in some sense. But of course, by leaving the central topic out of the painting and the description, we're left with a kind of sanitized, I don't want to say shallow, because that's not really fair, but a kind of emptiness that I think I would challenge most of your listeners who have been in a museum, that there's something attractive about the museum. There's this beauty around there, but then they read the descriptions or they take the audio tour, or I see them on the official tours, and after about 15 minutes, your eyes start to glaze over. Because there's only so much you can take with brushstrokes and oriental periods and this and that. And what you're actually missing is the search for God in the painting. I'll give you one example of this, because it was coming to my mind visually as you were asking about the struggle between money and God. An artist that really struggled with this was Rembrandt, who I'm sure everyone's aware of, one of the greatest painters in the history of mankind. He painted in the 1600s in the Dutch Republic of Amsterdam, which was a kind of Protestant culture, but very much the art world at that point had been taken over by the wealthy patrons, the wealthy merchants of Amsterdam, and they're all building these wonderful mansions, and they're kind of looking for artists to paint nice paintings, sort of as interior decoration projects. Rembrandt was a man of great spiritual depth, also had his own struggles, and in particular struggling with various affairs he was having, et cetera, which I won't go to at this moment. But so Rembrandt, one of his problems was he was frequently asked by people to paint like an interior decoration project, and he never quite gave people what they wanted. The Met has a painting of Rembrandt's, has several, but one that's a centerpiece in a pilgrimage is called Aristotle with the Bust of Homer. And I always introduce it to people as this was Rembrandt's greatest self-portrait. And people snicker and I go like, well, obviously the guy doesn't know what he's talking about. This is not a self-portrait. I mean, there's 74 self-portraits of Rembrandt, and this is not his face. What is going on here? And I go, this is a portrait of Rembrandt's soul. So let me take you through this, right? So the painting has Aristotle. He was asked by this wealthy merchant, actually a guy from Naples, side story, but asked to paint a painting of a Greek philosopher. And so he gives the guy a Greek philosopher, except what he paints is a reference to what they're all going through, right? The Greek philosopher Aristotle has got his right hand on the bust of Homer. Stands for the classical virtues. We were talking about some of them earlier: prudence, self-mastery, things that were adopted in Christianity. This guy's right hand there. His left hand is fingering a gold chain that's hanging around his neck with a medallion, which is the third portrait in the painting of Aristotle's most famous pupil, Alexander the Great. Alexander has given him this gold chain, which is the ill-begotten wealth of the world. And the patron is about to give Rembrandt a gold chain, if you will, for painting a nice interior decorating project, and Rembrandt wants to paint God. So Rembrandt paints this painting, and if you look at his face, this is incredible. It's a window into the soul of Rembrandt himself as he's struggling. Do I take the path of virtue, or do I take the gold chain? And you look at this and you see on his face, painted simply with oil on canvas, you can't figure out what he's going to do. He's literally thinking what to do. And then you go look at the right hand on the bust of Homer and you realize, wait a second, it's not firmly grasping the bust of Homer. It's kind of patting the bust of Homer. Well, how about the left hand? Well, it's not grabbing the chain, it's fingering it. And then you notice something else that's really interesting, John. He's painted the left hand larger than the right hand. Now, Rembrandt was one of the most skilled painters in the world. Okay? This is not an accident.
Right.
So he's telling us the draw, the lure of the gold.
Wow.
Be the downfall, right? And you're left with this image, and then you're standing in front of it, or in the book where you're sort of standing in front of it, and you're saying to yourself, that's me up there. Am I going to grab the gold chain, or I'm going to grab the bust of virtue? And John, this is a lifelong commitment and a daily struggle, not just for guys on Wall Street, but for anybody living in the world today. It's a lifelong commitment to be a Christian. It's a daily struggle to fulfill that mission.
The name of your book.
One image from the pilgrimage, but that's where we go.
Yeah, and there are many striking images in your book: Pilgrimage to the Museum, Man's Search for God Through Art and Time. I mean, I'm just looking at it. You were in a lot of the illustrations are from displays, I believe, at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, right? That's where a lot of the illustrations and what you write about is in this book.
Yeah, well, for a couple of reasons. One is we live in New York, so we get to New York a lot from Jersey and other places, but we have an apartment there. But we spend time in that museum, and we've spent 30, 40 years there. And so for us, we really understand those paintings really well, and it was like natural to us to use that. The other thing is that the Metropolitan Museum is an encyclopedic collection. It's probably the greatest encyclopedic collection in all the great art museums. So the Louvre and the British Museum come close. But if you ever wanted to attempt to tell the story of man's search for God through art from the very beginnings of Western art, which is ancient Egypt, and take it right through the moderns, right through Picasso and Pollock and Salvador Dali and Hopper, you could probably only do it in a couple of different art museums. So it's not about the Metropolitan Museum. It's about art, but we do use a lot of images from the Metropolitan Museum. About 90% of the images are from there. We use others only where we felt it was really key to the story in some ways.
So it's certainly worth a visit. So if readers pick up your book and read it, which they will with great delight, then make a visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art if they haven't already done so. You take people, as I'm told here in a beautiful note I got, on a spiritual time machine from Egypt's Old Kingdom through Greece and Rome to medieval Europe, from the age of the Renaissance through the ages of exploration and enlightenment, and from the rise of atheism in the late 1800s to the seeds of a spiritual rebirth. So the rise of atheism in late 19th century, tell us about that.
Yeah, that's a dark moment in the history of the world, and certainly in the history of art. And, there's a moment in art at the very beginning of the Renaissance in 1300. There's a painting at the Metropolitan by Duccio where the artist begins for the first time to take art from this completely spiritual world, which it's in that kind of abstract vision of the Middle Ages, to an attempt to paint the soul of man. We talked about that with Rembrandt, but Duccio was the one who really started this quest. And then when you get into the late 1800s and the age of enlightenment, I like to think of it as the late age of endarkenment. God is dead, declares Friedrich Nietzsche, right?
Oh.
And, the artists begin to adopt that idea that God is dead.
So that's seeped into the culture.
Yeah. And of course, once God is dead, well, the soul is dead.
Mm-hmm.
And artists begin to attempt to paint that reality. And it starts, I call it the anti-Duccio moment. Edward Manet, a lot of folks who know much about art would know his famous painting, Luncheon on the Grass, which is at the Louvre. But at the Met, they have a similar painting of the same ilk by Manet called A Boy in the Costume of a Mojo. And most people look at this painting and say, well, what's interesting about this, Steve? I mean, this is just like, a guy like a matador, it looks like. I mean, what is so dramatic here? Why did this thing at the time was rejected by the parish art salon? Because it was, it was a scandal. What's going on? I call it the anti-Duccio moment. Manet has asserted basically that there is no soul here, and I'm not going to try to paint it. So, in contrast, say, to the Duccio, or we talked about earlier, the Rembrandt, where you look at the image of the face of Aristotle, really Rembrandt, and you see a window into his soul. The Manet, the boy in the painting, is painted with a blank face. In fact, Manet has spent far more time painting the play of light against the silk embroidery of the suit and the cape he's carrying, and he's showing his dexterity with paint, if you will. But from his perspective, there is no soul. And that declaration that art is no longer here to lift us up to God, that we have no soul, leads artists into a really dark time. Rennes Cathedral becomes, I call it God's tomb, a painting of God's tomb. We could talk about that. Then you get into Van Gogh, and God he still thinks there is a God, but it's a very scary God, right? I mean, you can think of some of the Van Gogh paintings, Starry, Starry Night, people know in the pilgrimage we have that painting, but also we feel with Cyprus, where God is this scary force that's out there. And then, of course, Picasso, utter rejection of God. And then, of course, once we reject God in his existence, we become very lonely. Mm. And you get into the paintings of George Seurat. There's this wonderful painting at the Met called Circus Sideshow. And I find it so ironic. There's all these musicians playing in a, and you'd think, well, these should be happy people. They're playing together in a band.
Yeah.
And Seurat's more interested actually in showing that he can paint dusk and images through a dusk. It's really technically incredible painting. But the what it evokes for me is this utter loneliness. These individual band players seem to not be aware of each other's existence even. And no one seems happy. And, you know, brings me back to the streets of New York that we were talking about earlier. But, and then you get to Edward Hopper, you know, and I mean, things are like viewed for them, you know, really lonely, the loneliness of the cityscape. When we reject God, that's where we head, John, you know, and some artists have begun to find him again. The book ends with this wonderful, where I think Dali kind of gets it right again. So there's hope.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, are there any artists today incorporating the idea of God?
Sure, there are. There are religious artists, but I really like to focus on Salvador Dali because he's a really interesting character. I mean, he was raised by an atheist father. His mother was a devout Catholic, but he was raised as an atheist, and eventually meets a woman who becomes his muse, and she's a devout Catholic. And Dali has this major reconversion experience. In some ways, not dissimilar to my own, perhaps. Not to equate the magnitude of it with Dali, but and he starts painting in this modern style surrealism, but with a devout Christian faith. And one of the great images at the Metropolitan in my mind, it's because it's very modern, but it's Christ crucified, which is very unpopular, by the way, crucifixion paintings, but
it's very unpopular.
Generally, crucifixion paintings these days don't sell well at the Sotheby's art auctions. But you know, he's standing there, Christ, he's holding himself to the cross. There's no nail wounds, actually. So he's holding himself to the cross, and he's actually resurrecting at the same time. So it's an illusion. And this is, I think, what Dali figures out as a modern artist, is that the reason why crucifixion paintings aren't terribly popular, we have a couple of good ones in the pilgrimage from the Middle Ages, because people don't like to focus on the struggle of the cross so much. You know, that's not the happy image of Christianity. No. So he presents it. Of course, the people in the Middle Ages know the cross is the path to redemption. It's not Jesus's end, but his beginning, right? His conquering of death. But Dali shows us the conquering of death in the cross, so that Jesus is literally resurrecting in whole body, not in tortured form, his resurrected body sort of holding on to the cross. So people get it, like this is about the resurrection. And what I love about the painting is it also flips over another motif that crosses us up spiritually right from the very beginning. I mean, call it original sin, if you will, but the sin of pride, right? I mean, when we start out in ancient Egypt, and all Egyptian art is searching for God, but of course the Egyptians, like most of us, this is pre-revelation theology, they think of themselves as gods. I mean, they want to make themselves gods. And there's this wonderful image from 2300 BC, 5,000 years ago, where we start the pilgrimage of Purnab building a tomb for himself with all the little people bringing him all his favorite things. And he's seated as a god bigger than life, right? So this big people, little people problem keeps coming up through 5,000 years. It's a recurring theme of how we all lose track of God when we try to make ourselves God.
Yeah.
What I love about the Dali painting is Dali gets it right. He's put into the painting the image, not really of himself, but in a way as a proxy for himself, his wife, Gala. And she's on her knees, smaller than Jesus, who's resurrecting. And so, you are God, I am not. You kind of get it straight. And it's the conquest of love over hate. He's reminding us that in the end of the day, whether you're on the streets of New York doing a mission or on a pilgrimage to a museum, love conquers all, love conquers over hate. And I think it's a confidence that we have to have when we moan about the current secular culture, which has got all these problems.
Sure has. Which I was about to say, in an age of social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, I'm running out of apps, but there's multiple ones. Everybody is a friend, everybody's connected, and yet there's so much social isolation. It's the greatest irony of all time. Is that reflected in modern art today?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you see it. There's this deep sadness you get. There's an image painted by Picasso called Blind Man's Meal. And it's a wonderful contrast to an image that appears by a painter who painted 400 years ahead of Picasso, El Greco. And El Greco had an enormous influence on Picasso. I think people actually know that. Because El Greco in some ways painted in a kind of similar fashion. He was almost a modern painter before his time, but El Greco, being a mystic, was fervently Catholic. And of course, Picasso being, we don't know too much about Picasso, but would assume he was pretty fervently atheist. And he paints the opposite of a painting that El Greco paints many years earlier called The Curing of the Blind Man, which is a wonderful painting about how a blind man manages to see Christ. And the people of the world standing around him, the Pharisees, fail to see Christ because they're too engaged chasing gold chains, if you will. But Picasso paints this image called Blind Man's Meal. And again, God is dead. There is no communion. There is no God in the Eucharist. And now it's just a blind man sitting by himself at a table. There's a chalice of wine and a piece of bread in front of him. And he's fumbling around with his hands trying to find them. And the rest of the painting is very dark. And there's this sense of the artist that, they're kind of struggling with where we are here once we've given up God. And I think where we are is in a very difficult place. God is at the center of everything. When we deny our creator, we almost deny beauty, right? I mean, he is perfect beauty. Mm-hmm. And I think artists have this particular connection to God because he's given them that talent to communicate beauty, which is him. And when they deny that and they run from it, I think their struggle is harder than many of us. I mean, so many of the modern artists, I don't know, so many is probably too strong a term, but some of them do end pretty poorly, with their lives. I think of Van Gogh or Pollock, how they became kind of lost in this morass, if you will.
Steve, doesn't artists who back in their time who were elevated and they put God at the center of their art pieces and illustrations, don't they at the end of the day need patrons to put them in that position? Maybe there are great artists out there who do the same kind of work today, but they've no sponsors, they've no patrons, they've no corporations behind them.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not an expert on the current modern, how it works, John, but basically a theme that comes through in pilgrimage. I mean, you're drawing stuff out of me that I don't normally talk about. My wife says I don't connect enough dots for people when I write,
Well,
like I don't like
articulate on this, and it's really thought-provoking.
Yeah, I don't like to connect dots. I like to let the reader connect the dots. But don't
tell.
There are dots and crumbs thrown out there about this point that you can almost follow the money to find the art. And there's, wherever the money goes, that tends to, because artists, as you say, they need the patronage to pay for the works. And you follow that from the tomb of Perneb in 2300 BC all the way through the Middle Ages, where the art is sponsored by religious figures, clerics, if you will, and then into the wealthy patrons of the Renaissance. And then, of course, those patrons themselves start to lose God, and art goes that way. There's a wonderful image in pilgrimage of Rembrandt's last painting, which is a painting many people would be familiar with. It hangs at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. It's called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And what's interesting about this image, I mean, we learn a lot about Rembrandt and pilgrimage, and we see that he had his own struggles in many ways, like all of us do. And The Return of the Prodigal Son, by now, he has no patrons, Rembrandt, the greatest artist of all time, perhaps, some would say, actually dies a pauper. And he paints pilgrimage, he paints The Return of the Prodigal Son without a patron. It's really his last statement of himself and his struggle to find God. I bring it up because the patron thing kind of came to mind there. And when you get into the moderns, the patrons now are folks with a lot of money that many of them aren't necessarily that focused on spirituality, and art kind of goes that direction.
Yeah. Very interesting. We could spend a lot of time on that. I can just think of major corporations. I wonder what they sponsor, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters. I don't know, but it would be interesting to get those kind of answers at some point. You've had a distinguished career on Wall Street. You're on business media. We see you on TV, on Bloomberg and all of those great outlets. You said earlier you had a reconversion 20 years ago. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, my heart stopped, John, and
literally stopped.
Yeah, well, electrical malfunction. It didn't really stop, but it was certainly. It took a while for the doctors to figure out what was wrong with me. I said 20 years ago, and I'm thinking now it's over 20 years now. It's probably about 22 years ago, but. So I found myself flat on my back in an ICU ward for 12 days while they're trying to fix me. And it could have been my work on Wall Street was during one of the great crises, maybe caused me to short circuit. I don't know. But I think it was really a wake-up call from God. And I got a priest came to see me and to hear my confession and give me last rites. And I hadn't been to confession at that point in 20 years. And, but on the other hand, given that it seemed at least possible that I would be meeting with St. Peter shortly, I thought it might not be a bad idea. And that confession, frankly, probably in retrospect, I look back on it and say, it it wasn't a complete confession, if you will. I think when you've been away from a long time, you almost lose track of what's sinful and what isn't. But it began a new spiritual journey for me. And one of the things that I came away from that, the priest said to me afterwards, he goes, Steve, you're a good guy and all those things, but you're using your talents, your wealth, if you will, for you. And that's not why God gave them to you. And it led to a commitment at that moment to redirect my life and to use my talents and treasure for his kingdom, not mine. And, that led to things like the street mission in New York, to the Lumen Institute, which I'm on the board of, trying to form leaders, Catholic leaders in their faith better, to bring it to the workplace, influence one, influence many. It led to the museum tour, which led to this wonderful book, Pilgrimage to the Museum. So yeah, I'm still on that journey, John. I wish I could tell you that I'm a saint and that I'm perfect.
I don't know how to judge saints, Stephen.
Yeah.
Better leave that to some other authority. You sound very saintly to me, though.
I do think that when I talk around the country on these topics, what is fascinating to me, and I tell my wife when I get home, I go, sweetie, I think maybe I'm starting to understand why I'm getting dragged into this stuff. I think it's because I work on Wall Street. I think it's because I'm a kind of a guy deep in the thick of the arena, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I'm not perfect, but people can relate to me. I think in a way pilgrimage is like that too. I mean, if you're an art historian, I know you'll enjoy it, but it's not for people that are like art historians or professional academics. It has none of that lingo. Yeah. It's not
accessible for the lay reader.
It's really, and it's written by someone who's like them, struggling to find God. It's not the holier than thou kind of author. I wish I was one, but I'm not. But so I think that's what makes it sort of marvelous in some ways.
Well, you said something there that people are drawn to you, it sounds like. You work on Wall Street. Of course, on Wall Street, there's a lot of currents flow through Wall Street. The human emotions, the financial emotions, the economy going up and down, the politics, the interactions with colleagues, the big wealth that's made, the wealth that's lost. I mean, it's a crucible of a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, it is a world, and I was not being sarcastic when I said to you, I don't know that I could have survived 40 years doing this without my faith.
Yeah.
And it gives me, I think, the detachment I need, the self-mastery, the deep confidence and joy. I have a private theory. I don't know, it probably wouldn't be politically correct to write it up, and it's probably not correct anyway, but I do think that Catholics make particularly good investors because we tend to be optimists and we tend to be confident, and we think there's always going to be a better day, and in the end of the day, there usually is. So
I have to think about that. There's a lot of depth in that. I think Catholics, the ones who follow it by the rule, if you will, tend to be prudent and careful and shepherd their wealth and mind it and pass it on to the next generation and don't squander and so on.
Yeah, prudence is an important thing.
Prudence
also means risk taking too, though.
Risk taking, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean.
But everything in life is a risk.
To hide our light under a bushel, right? He wants us to take risks, but just be prudent about it, be thoughtful about it.
Yeah, I mean, every individual, through time has had to take risk. The farmers take risk. We don't know what the crop is. We don't know if it's going to rain for all season and the whole crop is ruined. You just don't know.
Yeah.
I guess pray to a higher power that, to your God, that everything is going to go good and you come out on the other end a little more prosperous. The name of your book, Stephen, is Pilgrimage to the Museum, Man's Search for God Through Art and Time. Give us any of the details where people can buy this. It's Sophia Crisis and Sophia Institute publications. Where can they read more about it? Website, ordering, and so forth.
Right. So Sophia Institute Press, certainly you can go directly in there and pre-order it. It's available, will be available through Amazon, Barnes and Noble. The Met itself is carrying the book at its bookstores. So, the distribution should be okay, but there's multiple sites where you could go and pre-order it right now. It should be out. The publisher told me that they think it might be coming in a little early. It's scheduled for July 26th, but it could be out as soon as a week or 10 days, I think.
So it's a great summer read. It's a great read all through the year, and put it in your Christmas stocking stuffer too later. Stephen Auth, been a pleasure talking to you. Take care and good luck with the new book.
Thank you, John.